Thank you very much. Indeed, we had one of the best discussions. I thought we had the best discussions, but the jury is out there. We did have some rich discussions, and I would go through it. So essentially, we talked about the causes of rising debts and potentially high debt distress, and then the potential solutions to it based on experiences, country experiences. So I just ran through a summary of what I managed to capture. And indeed, Doctor mentioned this is a burden. I'll try to summarize as much as I can, and they would come in to augment whatever I have left out. So in terms of the causes, we did mention the discussions. It emerged that first and foremost, maybe not first and foremost, but number one of the things, the key challenges that was identified was monetary instability and budget execution, which of course is related to rising debt levels in countries. The other related to that is the question of budget planning. In fact, some of the conversations hovered around planning, whether planning was effective or not effective. Some did say that we could have the best of planning, but when it comes to execution, it is challenged. And others, they say that we have, even from the onset, we have weak planning, so how do we then even execute? So these were some of the challenges that came up. So basically, because of the challenges with planning or the lack thereof, there is some variance between planned and actual execution. And this came out quite forcefully in our discussion. The other issue that came up was the issue of political interference. A lot of times, even with the best of planning, with the best of attempts to execute budgets, we still have political interference that come in midstreams and then basically throws off the planned budget, of course. So that's also a major issue in some of the countries. Another issue that came up was the transparency of budgets. Because of the lack of transparency and essentially because of the lack of transparency, financial statements are not being recorded or even used as premises or as foundations to approve subsequent budgets. So essentially, there's not much transparency around the budget. And then because of that, there's not visibility as to how much is owed, the total debt burden, and then the countries keep piling up on the debts. The other, I think this is also related, it's credibility of the budgets. It's related to what we had actually mentioned, planning vis-a-vis execution. And of course, the variance is very high, and because of that, we have rising debts. I think that there's also, we mentioned the accountability of budget execution. That's one thing I also recorded. Because of weak accountability structures in the countries, basically there's not much, whether there's variance in the budget's execution, there's not much that is, essentially, things move as normal, basically. And then year in, year out, the countries keep borrowing because there's not much accountability to the borrowed resources. The other point that I managed to capture was also currency depreciation in many countries, when there's basically in most of our countries, because of the volatility of the FX, the foreign exchange in our countries. Once the currency depreciates, it automatically increases our total debt stock, and that presents a critical challenge. It's also a key cause of rising debt in our countries. And then I think also another challenge that was mentioned was domestic resource, ineffective mobilization of domestic resources, and for that reason, countries would have to borrow to basically augment the budget shortfalls and the deficits in the budget. We did also have some peculiar cases with landlocked countries because of their peculiarity, the peculiarity of their countries, with low productivity, etc. And then when there's a little shock, well, not a little shock, but when there's a shock to the system in terms of political changes in the political systems where development partners pull off budget support, it has a lot of seismic effect on the budget, and for that reason they need to borrow more to basically augment the budget, the deficit in the budget. Also, the lack of a legal framework essentially in countries, basically defining the overall debt ceiling in countries also came out as one of the key challenges to rising debt. So, and this is also tied to the political environment, the political economy of our countries. Essentially, there are needs basically for politicians to fulfill. Infrastructure needs, basic service delivery, etc. And for a typical politician, they need the resources to wherever it comes from to basically deliver on these critical infrastructure and critical services to the population. And for that reason, because there is not a ceiling, a legal framework that defines the debt ceiling, essentially countries keep borrowing and then increasing their debt stock. So I think and then there was also the mention of external shocks, and particularly for many countries, fragile countries, transition states. External shocks is one of the key issues that came out, particularly rising effects and impacts of climate on the countries, on these countries, and then countries would have to borrow more, basically, to be able to address some of the devastating impacts of these shocks, particularly climate, as we see the recurrence more and more year in and year out. And we did also just mention the issue of weak capacity of oversight institutions, debt management institutions, and for that reason they are not able to monitor and to monitor and evaluate some of the debts that countries are basically contracting and managing. So I think these are the points that I was able to capture. And then Prof. and then Joanne can come in. And then, yes. So I'll go to solutions now. So for the solutions, we did mention that there has to be a paradigm shift in the way we look at things, in the way countries look at or view debt, essentially. And basically what I captured was to move towards strategy-driven budgeting, essentially, so that even politicians come and go, we will still have strategic objectives that basically the country will have to meet that will surpass political tenures and political manifestos and agendas. So basically, a strategic shift towards development and strategy-driven budgeting. And then we also have fiscal discipline, the need to basically essentially enforce some discipline in our fiscal measures. And then so that we can begin to bridge the variance between planning and then budget execution, so much so that when unplanned or unbudgeted commitments come in between the year, then we are able to address them without necessarily going off plan. And then the other solution was to basically have a way of stalling the rolling over debts. And one of our director mentioned the need to basically put in some form of measures to basically address that. But there has to be some commitment from the government to be able to do that, to stop the piling over of debts. And then I think a lot of comments also came around addressing capacity challenges with at the front office, the middle office, and the back office. Basically, there has to be a system-wide approach to it in terms of capacity development, and there has to be coordination across that system so that we'll be able to deliver, to manage effectively the budget. The debts, basically. And also this is related to coordination, strengthening coordination across the debt oversight institutions and the debt management institutions. And then strengthening the legal framework for debts, it also came out, the policy framework, the implementation framework, the regulatory frameworks all came out. Then we also mentioned establishing, setting up a sinking fund with experiences from different countries, and this also goes to addressing the issue of rolling over the budget, the debt repayments, essentially. The poor investments of debts, basically we talked about it, and then measures to strengthen it included devising some kind of template that all government agencies would have to basically apply, so that when, and a criteria essentially, so that when there's a project, a capital project, for example, that comes in midstream, they have to be subjected to these criteria. And before they can make it into a given budget. So at least it helps us with the variations. Borrowing in FX also costs money, as we alluded to earlier on. So the solution to that was to develop domestic financial markets and to strengthen and deepen them, so that governments will begin to borrow domestically as a way of addressing the FX challenges that we mentioned. And I think that is about it. Thank you very much. And then I have Dr. here who wants to add. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nman Hassan. By the time I make a point, I guess Joanne might make a final comment. But let me emphasize that from everything we gathered, we have a couple of structural comments as well. First is that you will notice that the countries in high distress of debt constitute about 43% of transition countries. That means there is a strong correlation between being in transition and being in a situation of high distress as regards debt. So invariably, in the medium to long term, while we grapple with these short-term solutions, which are relatively within our reach, in the medium to long term, there is solutions lie with the structural issues that constrain countries to become transition. So those structural issues must still be there, because even if in the short to medium term we address these issues and we regain their sustainability and normalcy, if those structural issues reoccur in the future, then you relapse into the crisis. So it's good to also, while we try to deal with the issues short term, it's good to be looking forward to the structural issues that must be prevented so that these issues don't reoccur in the future. And these issues, from what the country said, include political instability. You know, in many of African countries, they're still in a flux, even to decide whether they want to be countries or nations or not. That is important. There are countries that are still not sure whether they want to be one country or 20 countries, or whether they want to be a uniform country or they want to be part of a country dominating another part of the country. So those issues must be addressed. Otherwise, these economic and debt management issues will continue occurring. Of course, the other issue is the issue of security generally, particularly those arising from militias and even terrorism, external aggression by various groups of sectarian and faith-based attack, terrorists. So those issues are also important because those are issues that force countries to become crisis-ridden and transitional. Of course, the third factor, which was also mentioned, which is again structural, are things that come from shocks, particularly external shocks, either from the climatic shocks or economic shocks like the wars between Ukraine and Russia and all COVID, those type of shocks. So also there need, and I'm sure institutions like the African Development Bank and the World Bank, I'm aware, they're also thinking about instruments and measures and strategies to use to deal with those issues. Because once a country has a barrage of those external shocks, climatic and otherwise, it leads to financial crisis and eventually to debt crisis. But for individual countries, from the experience of these countries that I discussed and from other countries, it's obvious that to deal with these external shocks, we have to deliberately accept that external shocks are a permanent feature. And therefore, we must have permanent institutions and permanent economic measures, including the building up reserves, specifically waiting for those shocks. The reserves could be you can talk of financial reserves, but more importantly, African countries must also be thinking seriously about physical, apart from fiscal, physical reserves in terms of accumulating a lot of products, a lot of agricultural products, a lot of food products, so that if there's shock, we will still be able, if there's desertification or there are climatic shocks or there's no rainfall for 2 or 3 years, you will still be able to feed our people because we have a buffer of stocks. But that means that also we have to think seriously about agricultural productivity as a measure. So those are some of the structural issues that came out from these more or less symptoms. Because as far as it can be summarized that debt issues as essentially symptoms, but there are the diseases somewhere. It's those diseases that must be attacked in the medium to long term. Otherwise, we continue battling with the symptoms recurringly. So thank you very much. Joanne, you want to say 1 or 2 things?
Just 2 minutes so that
Yeah, I'm not going to repeat something, but you know what we have here, I can just see that we're starting to be a family. You know, in family support one another through thick and thin. We learn from one another, and we communicate to one another. So addressing these issues, I mean, we all know what is the problems that we're facing, what are the causes. I mean, it's very familiar to us. But I think going forward, bear in mind that support is available. Through the African Development Institution is now our platform where we can work through. And through the leadership of Dr. Eric, I think we're going to achieve we can address many of these problems. Short-term problems, medium-term problems, long-term problems. But all I want to say here is that going back from here, we must also bear in mind, although there's support available, but it's also our responsibility to make a difference and to go back and say, what have I learned? What is it that I picked up? And how can I implement that for the better of my country, in the context of my country? Thank you very much.
Okay, so we'll move to group 2. So if the rapporteur is here, and then so you can take yours, and then Chidi.
Well, as for group 2, we have a very interesting discussion too. In our session, there were nearly 30 participants representing 7 countries. These were Liberia, Niger, Burkina Faso, Madagascar, Guinea, DRC, and Togo. I will take advantage that colleagues reporting back from group number 1 already discussed a lot the challenges posed by structural problems, macroeconomic dynamics, and other factors, and how they affect the challenges they pose for debt management. And I will report back more on another point that all countries discuss, namely the technical assistance needs. And of course, these needs relate to the underlying problems whose causes were discussed by Group 1 at length. So, in terms of technical assistance needs in the area of debt management, it was interesting to notice that despite of having 7 countries that one could argue are different from one another, an heterogeneous group indeed, there are some common threads and concerns in the area of debt management technical assistance needs. So I will try to just summarize these common topics, trying to make justice to the specificities of these 7 countries, and at least we get a sense of what they all have in common. Well, all the countries mention in one way or another the importance of the legal framework to set the stage for the debt management functions. Now, in some countries, the legal framework is to be established. Liberia, for instance, still working on drafting and enacting public debt law. Other countries like Togo already have that law. But it was very important, those that are in the process of drafting and enacting, to receive technical assistance to ensure the law is adequate and fit to purpose. Countries who already have a law, they were also concerned about the implementation of the law. You know, having a parliament passing a piece of legislation is the end of a process and the beginning of another, because the law has to be implemented. There will be a need for bylaws, ministerial decrees, a large set of legal documents and practices that will provide granularity and details to the overall generic provisions that the public debt law may envisage. So the legal framework is an important area for TA. Next, all countries raise the importance of establishing a debt management office, a proper debt management office that can carry out the functions delegated or assigned, from the law. And here, again, the heterogeneity of the countries led to some of them recognizing that the debt management office has been established, but needs to be working better, and other countries still struggling to find the right model for that office, to have it properly reflected in the organigram of the Ministry of Finance and organized in terms of front, middle, and back office functions. All the countries indicated that they need assistance to improve the functioning of the debt management office. And there were different areas in which this TA would be needed. If one of them is the capacity to gather information and centralize functions. For instance, colleagues from the colleague from DRC mentioned the importance of to centralize the data. Then, as it happens in many places around the world, the line ministries have a capacity to start the negotiation of projects and loan contracts, and later on they are passed to the Ministry of Finance, and all countries concur in that this practice should be reformed for the better, and the Ministry of Finance should be aware of project negotiations in an early stage. Another problem with fragmentation of data concerning the disbursements, what we have observed in these 7 countries, but also in others, is that when it's about debt service payments, you may have the back office able to account for those payments, plan those payments, have good information about the upcoming obligations. But when it's about the disbursements, that is the beginning of the borrowing activity, sometimes the information does not come on time because it's handled by the line ministries or the Ministry of Economic Planning in the first place, and transmitted sometimes late and in an imperfect manner to the Ministry of Finance. So centralizing information on disbursement is also very important. Now that brings me to another area in which countries think a technical assistance would be worth having. That's the debt recording. I think that all of the 7 countries mention that they need proper information systems to record debt and manage debt. Many of them mentioned that they are transitioning from the SIGARE version 6 to the version 7 system and will need support on that. That support includes having staff in the back office being able to understand the system, to operate the system, having them equipped in the accounting conventions and financial conventions that are necessary to translate the provisions from a loan contract into the entries in the SIGADE or any other, or Meridian or any other system for debt management. And at this point, a few countries mentioned the importance of generating information on the debt in a fashion consistent with other requirements in the public administration, in particular public finance accounting and public finance audits. So technical assistance in ensuring a consistency between debt records and public finance records more broadly will be worth having. This brought the issue of how the debt management office has to interact with other stakeholders, like the comptroller or the general audit. And this is something that has to be addressed too. Then moving out of the back office and going to the middle office, most countries, and in particular Guinea and Togo, explicitly mention the importance of having analytical tools that equip the DMO to set up a proper debt borrowing strategy and a risk framework. They mentioned the need to receive technical assistance to produce reports like the medium-term debt management strategy or the debt sustainability analysis. Although it was not mentioned explicitly, my feeling was that also reports on fiscal risks stemming from debt management would be useful. Our colleagues from Togo emphasized the importance of having good fiscal analysis, and of course some of the fiscal needs are coming from that. Colleagues from Madagascar brought to the discussion the establishment of monitoring and evaluation functions within the DMO, ideally in the middle office, that can be used to assess the efficiency of the borrowed funds allocated to the financing of certain projects or spending programs. Something that I personally think is an aspect that sometimes gets lost in the traditional discussions about the management strategy and DSA. It's very important to determine, to have a sort of a cost-benefit analysis to determine whether borrowed funds are an appropriate source to finance certain projects. And that is something that requires the DMO to participate. And next, and to conclude, moving from the middle office to the front office, many of the countries emphasize the need to have technical assistance to support the understanding on how to negotiate with foreign lenders. In Madagascar, in which there is the intention to develop domestic markets, there was also a reference to having the front office able to manage investor relations with local banks, or I would presume other institutional investors that would be interested in purchasing government securities in local markets. And finally, and this based on what colleagues from Burkina Faso emphasized, it's going to be important for the front office in the DMO to be aware and to some extent play either a coordination role or a convening role when there are many agencies in the government that engage in discussions or negotiations to raise funds from abroad, be it from donors, from potential financiers. So the front office should have and should be equipped to centralize or at least have some understanding of the different efforts that are made in different parts of the public administration to search for funds abroad. So I think these were the common topics that pop up as in our conversations about technical assistance needs. There were, of course, other miscellanea of other topics, probably more specific to each country and not shared by all. I am not making justice to these more country-specific topics because we want to have the big picture. But overall, it was a very instructive conversation. And as I mentioned to the participants in our session and now to the plenary, this discussion on technical assistance need that each country has had, and we are now all sharing conclusions, is going to be a very important input in the design of any technical assistance program that hopefully the African Development Bank, through the program that was presented yesterday, will be able to carry it out for the benefit of all transition states. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johan. So we'll call on Group 3, countries in debt distress, to make their own presentation.
Okay, so we are from Group 3, and our interest has to do with countries in debt distress. Fortunately, we used to have 4 of countries here present being in debt distress. But as we began, we realized that Somalia has actually been off from that bracket because of the relief, the HIPIC relief they received in December last year. So currently you can see that their debt levels are not as high as the others. But the issue is they are still moderate risk, so they decided to share their experience with us. And the issue is, why are they still moderate risk if they have been forgiven? No. The debt forgiveness came from the multilateral, the MDBs, bilateral organizations, and a few of the commercial creditors who actually, so they still have a component which is coming from the Arab world, which they are yet to complete. Once they're able to get that through, then they will have a total 100% debt relief. So they joined us to share the experience. So that was on the case of Somalia. We have Sudan, and we all know the issue relating to Sudan. Sudan is not currently stable, and so 3 key areas they shared with us was that when the war broke out, they were not in that position to be able to even pick data. So as we speak now, if you ask them the total debt, the office cannot tell. It's a problem with them now. Secondly, the system was in Khartoum, and so where they have moved to, they don't have even the system to view it, and that is even if they go back and the system is even functional, it is even destroyed. That would be another issue to go through. But at least Somalia's experience was there and was shared for them to also know how to navigate that route. Then we had Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe has been around for some time because of some issues that we all know. They have gone through some restructuring, but they are still not there yet. One thing that was key was that in 2011, the DMO, or the Debt Management Office, was established. And was not just established, it was also established backed by law, where the frontier office, middle office, and back office, they all had their responsibilities or their roles to play. They are in the process of getting a debt relief, but there are things that needs to be done. One area they raised has to do with the arrears clearance, which has been a main issue with Zimbabwe. And for that, we even take it that the AFDB president was actually selected or was a champion to help in clearing the arrears of that country. And because Mozambique had also gone through similar issues, the former president was also courted to actually moderate that discussion and to bring that to a point there. I don't want us to go through, but I just want to put on the few highlights that we picked from that's based on the areas that we were supposed to cover. So one was the challenges, the second was the common reforms, and then the third was policy recommendation. So Some of the areas have already been highlighted by other group, but permit me to just rehash them again. So one has to do with the required legislation that actually mandated that office was not existent in most countries. So that was a key challenge. Some, you find just a line in a Loans Act saying that they need to perform this role. But currently, as we speak, that is not the case. Most of the countries have, or going through, Zimbabwe have a new legislation that is shaping that debt management office. Another area of concern was the weak capacity in some of the units, or let's say, depending on whether it's a department or division. So the front office has this challenge, middle office has this challenge, and the back office also has this challenge. So staffing, and from Zimbabwe, we're told that they are hardly at optimal level in terms of staffing in any of the units. So that is a key area that we realized was a challenge for them as a country. Then we also saw that there's also the functions are scattered. So you find that the same debt management function is being performed by the central bank, the controller and accountant general, the Ministry of Finance, budget is playing a role, and another. So it was more like not coordinated in a way to be able to know at real time how much is being done on that. So that was also a key area that we needed that. We also realized that all these countries that we are in debt distress, they have one way or the other experience either domestic or external shocks. We know the external shocks already, but then the domestic ones, in the case of Zimbabwe, they started clearing the arrears, especially the multilateral arrears, they started clearing it. And then in 2023, they had a drought, which actually destroyed most of the projections that they have done for. So that became a challenge, and as a result of that, they are not able to actually continue to service that the way they had wanted. The next was weak documentation. Reporting was a challenge. There was no transparency in terms of how much is being taken and how much is being recorded. So in the case of Somalia, at the time when they started this debt HIPC negotiation, before they reached the completion point, at the time they started, they didn't even have evidence on any single debt that they had acquired, procured. So it took a long time for them to be able to come to that conclusion as to how much debt Somalia owes for them to even go for the HIPC bargaining. Another area has to do with, there's also staff turnover. Realize that in terms of compensation for countries, in terms of compensation for staff, it is very low in most countries. And so when staff are trained on the particulars, especially with the system, the debt management systems, and I must indicate that all the groups, the countries that met now, they use the DEMFAS. So when you are, these officers are trained and they get opportunity, they exit, and if there's no plan to more like transfer knowledge, they leave and there's nothing, nobody can manage the system, and it brings the whole system down. That's also something. Then we also said that most of these countries, because of their peculiar nation as debt distress, they only qualify for concessional financing. But concessional financing in terms is very small. It cannot do much. So that is also another big challenge. They have infrastructure needs. They have huge gap in terms of infrastructure gap. But then because of their peculiar situation now, they cannot even qualify for any loan external. If they will have to procure any loan, they should come from the multilateral or the bilateral organization, which is also becoming difficult to assess now. So that is a key area that we... Then let's look at the... and then the other one was touched on the revenue issue. Revenue, all these issues we are discussing about debts, the root cause is from the revenue. Countries that we met, the issue is that most of them are not well diversified in terms of their revenue base. Either they are reliant on one single resource which provides revenue. So in times of where there's economic turmoil, where the prices drop, then we have this issue of having to go out to borrow to fund the gap that is created. So what are the common grounds that we saw? Realize that currently, most countries are having a common framework or having a legislation that actually is spelling out the roles of the front office, middle office, back office, and the various responsibilities as I indicated for officers. So that is something common that we realize from it. Another thing we saw from distressed countries was that because of their peculiar nature, all of them are now operating based on a robust, let's say, debt management committee, so that we don't, more like in terms of transparency. So in Zimbabwe, for instance, we hear of the domestic and external debt coordinating committee, or they coordinate the committee actually, and then they go through, but below that they also have a technical committee where they try to collaborate with other agencies related, and then in order to inform the ministers to the borrowing requirements and what needs to be done. So that is also with, so that is very key also on that. Policy recommendation from the group. The first one was that debt must be procured for productive sectors to generate the needed growth, especially commercial financing. And in that case, how can you procure from commercial financing angle? It will depend on whether your ability to appraise bankable projects that are viable. So once you're able to appraise bankable projects and you make them available to external investors, then you can even get private sector players come into these projects, execute, and because these projects are self-financing projects, you expect that at the end of the day, the project will generate the needed cash flows to pay back the loan. So that was another, that was a very key policy recommendation for the bank, that if we can support the units responsible for project appraisals to be able to, because sometimes one thing having the private sector conduct or undertake the project appraisal documents. The other thing is that the officers who have to review must also have the capacity to review to see whether, if they are saying the project is bankable based on the net present value or the internal rate of return, which are actually used in doing this analysis, then officers will also in the capacity to review to see whether, even if the assumptions they made in their financial model or the economic model make sense, in order to come to that determination that this project is financially viable or economically viable. So that was something that I thought is very good for us, that MDBs, including AFDB, we may have to support countries in project appraisal. Then capacity strengthening, I mentioned capacity, requirement of TAs to help support the various blocks within the debt management office. That is also there. Then another area was countries in transition in general, not just only with debt management or the debt distressed countries. One item on the debt that comes up is the resource-backed loans. Resource-backed loans. And the issue is that because there's no transparency sometimes on these resource-backed loans, when countries get to a point where their debt levels are unsustainable, you go back to realize that even the kind of arrangements they went into, those arrangements were not actually good for the country in there. But then if there is transparency, I'm told that the French version is not. Okay, so it's back now. So what I'm saying that these resource-backed loans have become more like another key issue. So their recommendation is that maybe if MDBs and other, including AFDB and other, can provide kind of technical assistantship on how to navigate around these resources so that, yes, you have the resources, you can get value for money in terms of what kind of agreements you go with these creditors or commercial creditors in that line. Another key policy recommendation is that when countries are in debt distress, we should try as much as possible to reduce fiscal dominance, which has been a very key issue. Fiscal dominance in our countries has led most countries to debt distress. And so once you are in that, you don't have to continue in that line. And then another policy recommendation was that we need to have, and the good thing is that those countries in debt distress already have these coordinating committees working to make sure that debt levels are sustainable and we don't return back to high. Zimbabwe is doing well, the debt levels are declining. Sudan's case is a peculiar case. We cannot, because currently there's issue there and therefore we cannot go there. Somalia, like I indicated, are moderate risk of debt distress because of the other creditors not also coming on board too. Especially China has a chunk in also there, and Kuwait Fund and other Arab funds are also released. Then the next policy recommendation is that debt management committee and cash management committees, especially if you don't have a unit, the ideal when Johan had a presentation, the ideal thing is to have the debt management office and then the cash management office being coordinated under the same, maybe annual, like in the same debt office to be able to work, or in the same treasury to be able to work. But countries are not in that level. What we could do is that you should have a coordination between the cash management, maybe a committee. It may not have a unit yet. A committee and the debt management committee should always have that synergy so that whatever is being forecasted in your debt or cash management framework, they also know of, and then they can also make funds available at right time to make debt service payment, as has been the case. I think our group, the other group mentioned it, the support of procurement of debt management system to man this. And then the last one I want to touch on strengthening the audit office to be able to audit debt-related expenditures. We realize that most often in our countries, the audit office, if I'm not mistaken, their auditing purely relates to expenditures, revenue from controller account, general government expenditure, compensation, goods and services, CAPEX. But they don't veer into that arena of auditing debt management. And so sometimes when the issues are reported, it's as if they don't even have any clue as to how to handle that. So recommendation is also that if you can strengthen the the audit office in countries to be able to police these processes. Because sometimes the law is clear. It goes to Parliament, Parliament approves, everything is done. But at the end, what is procured, if it's not used for its intended purpose or it doesn't generate that returns that is needed to pay back that facility, that becomes a challenge. So I will end here and call the, if you have any addition, okay. Okay, so that is the end from us. Thank you very much for that.